Before we begin this episode, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the young man at the heart of this story. Jay Slater was more than a headline. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, full of dreams, energy, and love. His disappearance, and the tragic circumstances surrounding his death, have left a deep wound not only in the hearts of his family and friends, but in the thousands of people around the world who followed his story and hoped for a different outcome. This episode, like every episode in this series, is created not to sensationalize, but to seek truth, to honor the questions that still remain, and to keep Jay's memory alive through clarity and compassion. To Jay's family, we cannot imagine your pain, but we stand with you in your search for answers. And we offer this work as a small gesture of solidarity, remembrance, and respect. May his soul rest in peace, and may justice, in all its forms, one day find its way to the light. From the moment Jay Slater's body was discovered in the rugged ravine known as Barranco de Juan Lopez, something about the official narrative didn't sit right with many people, both online and in the real world. Authorities stated Jay had fallen in a tragic accident while trying to make his way back to civilization, but that explanation raised more questions than it answered. This theory, that Jay's death may have been a simple fall, but possibly a cover-up or the result of foul play, exists for one central reason: too much doesn't add up. Jay's last known location was remote and steep, not easily accessed by someone unfamiliar with the terrain, let alone someone in distress, without water, and wearing unsuitable footwear. The fact that Jay would choose to trek across miles of mountainous land rather than retrace a simpler, more logical path left many confused. Even experienced hikers found those conditions challenging. So why was a young festival goer, likely exhausted and dehydrated, navigating such treacherous ground? But perhaps even more suspicious than the route itself is how long it took to find Jay, especially considering that his body was found just a short distance from his last known mobile phone location. Despite the use of helicopters, drones, sniffer dogs, and rescue teams, it took about 4 weeks to find him. How does a body go undetected for that long in such a concentrated search area? Did the terrain truly conceal him so well? Or was he not there the entire time? Then there are the forensic unknowns. We still don't have a publicly available post-mortem report. We don't know the nature or extent of Jay's injuries. We don't know if there were any defensive wounds, bruises inconsistent with the fall, or signs of prior trauma. The lack of transparency from official sources has left a vacuum, and that vacuum has only encouraged deeper questioning. Some speculate that Jay may have been unconscious or deceased before the fall. Others suggest he was placed in the ravine after being harmed elsewhere. If either were true, the injuries caused by a fall from height could mask vital evidence of foul play. Evidence that, depending on how long the body was exposed to extreme heat, may already be lost. Ultimately, this theory exists because there is a fundamental tension between the simplicity of the official story and the complexity of the unanswered questions. Jay was found, but that doesn't mean the mystery is solved. To understand whether Jay Slater's death was truly the result of an accidental fall, we must start by examining the very place his body was discovered: the Barranco de Juan Lopez ravine, a steep ravine in the rugged region of northwestern Tenerife, near the village of Masca. The ravine is no ordinary trailside ditch. In local terms, a barranco refers to a natural gully or gorge formed by erosion, often with steep, sometimes vertical, rock faces and sharp drops. The Barranco de Juan Lopez in particular is known for its harsh terrain, sparse vegetation, and deeply cut paths carved by centuries of water runoff, despite its now arid and dry conditions. Satellite images and terrain data confirm that parts of this ravine reach depths of exceeding 40 meters, with sheer drops, unstable rocks, and no obvious walking paths unless one is extremely familiar with this area. It's worth noting that Jay was not known to be an experienced hiker, nor was he dressed for such a trek. Even for a prepared trekker, venturing into this ravine in Tenerife's summer heat would be a considerable risk. The closest accessible route to the ravine from the Airbnb in Masca is rugged, uneven, and not signposted. It would have required Jay to either follow a winding road uphill or to take an unconventional, potentially dangerous shortcut through the wild terrain. The location where his body was ultimately found lies within close proximity to his final phone ping, but not necessarily in a place one would expect to reach unless deliberately heading downhill into a secluded area. This leads to a crucial question. Why would Jay go there at all? Was he lost and disoriented? Was he fleeing from something or someone, as the other theories suggest? Or more darkly, was he led or brought there against his will? There's another detail to consider. Locals in Masca, a tight-knit and relatively quiet village, expressed surprise that the search teams didn't find Jay sooner, given that the ravine had supposedly been searched early on. If that's accurate, it raises the chilling possibility that Jay may not have been in that spot the entire time, or that search efforts may have overlooked it due to its difficult angles and depth. Adding to the mystery is the relative silence from authorities regarding the exact positioning of the body. Was he at the base of a fall line? Was he tucked beneath rock overhangs or under debris? Was the discovery made by scent, sight, or another means? These are the kind of forensic details that would help validate the official explanation, yet they remain absent from public discussion. The geography of Juan Lopez Ravine does not lend itself easily to accidental discovery. It's a hidden place, removed from the usual paths, dangerous even to seasoned locals. If Jay stumbled into it blindly, it would be a tragic accident. But if someone led him there, or worse, left him there, then this ravine becomes not just a location, but a silent witness to something far more disturbing. When authorities suggest that Jay Slater died as the result of a fall, the immediate follow-up question is, what kind of fall? Was it a slip, trip, or something far more deliberate? To explore this, we need to consider the science and practical realities of falling in rugged terrain. In mountainous and ravine landscapes like those surrounding Masca, there are three primary types of accidental falls. The first is loss of footing on uneven or loose ground. Second is misjudging the edge of a drop or embankment. And third is attempting to descend steep areas without proper equipment or experience. Jay wasn't wearing suitable footwear, which provide minimal grip and ankle support. If he was walking across dry gravel, sloped rock, or loose earth, all common in the ravine, he would have been at a significantly increased risk of slipping. Add to that the reported heat of that day and the lack of water, and the conditions for heat stroke or disorientation increased dramatically, further impairing balance and decision-making. But the angle of descent matters too. In ravines like this, falls are not often clean vertical drops. Instead, the body can tumble in a ragdoll motion, striking rocks repeatedly on the way down. This results in multiple trauma points, lacerations, bone fractures, and potentially severe head trauma. However, if Jay had instead been pushed or even thrown from a higher ledge, the trajectory, impact site, and type of injuries could differ. A body in free fall, especially from a deliberate shove, could hit at higher velocity and may land in a more compact or unnatural position, which sometimes produces more focused trauma, particularly to the head, spine, or pelvis. Depending on the height and trajectory, this can either obscure or emphasize existing injuries, a point that becomes crucial later in our forensic analysis. There is also the possibility of what's known as a post-mortem fall, when a body is moved and pushed over a cliff or slope after death. Forensic experts can sometimes distinguish this based on blood flow patterns, rigor mortis development, or lack of defensive wounds. But such distinctions become increasingly difficult after prolonged exposure to heat, decomposition, or animal activity. Another red flag. No reports suggest that Jay left any visible drag marks, signs of climbing, or calling out from the ravine. If he had fallen by accident and survived initially, would he not have attempted to call for help or leave a sign? The absence of such evidence doesn't prove anything, but in the context of this theory, it raises suspicion. In summary, while a fall is entirely plausible, it is the type of fall, the circumstances around it, and the condition of the body that determine whether this was simply a tragic misstep or something that began with intent to harm. The forensic analysis of a body can tell us everything, or very little, depending on the condition it's found in. In Jay Slater's case, the condition of his body and the results of his post-mortem have been the subject of immense scrutiny. And while some answers were provided, many questions still linger, especially when trying to determine whether his death was the result of a simple accident or something much more sinister. According to the official findings, Jay died from traumatic head injuries, consistent with a fall from height. After his body was returned to the UK, a full post-mortem was carried out, and the results were read out during an inquest at Preston Coroner's Court. The details were stark. Jay had sustained extensive fractures to the left side of his head, fractures so severe they extended down to the base of his skull. He also had multiple pelvic fractures, which, according to the Home Office pathologist, were consistent with a heavy impact, likely caused by a vertical fall. It's also noted that Jay's injuries would have rendered him immediately unconscious, with death possibly occurring instantly. In isolation, these findings do support the official theory that Jay slipped, fell, and died on impact. But when you dig deeper, you begin to see how complex fall injuries can be, and how easily they can overlap with signs of foul play. Consider this. A person who is pushed or thrown can suffer the exact same injuries as someone who falls accidentally. A blow to the head before a fall could also be masked by the trauma caused during the fall itself. If Jay had been struck, even fatally, and then thrown or dropped into the ravine, then the post-mortem findings could still appear consistent with a fall. In many forensic investigations, it's the pattern and nature of the injuries that provide those distinctions. For example, the angle of a skull fracture, the depth of a bruise, or the presence of defensive wounds can reveal whether a person was conscious during the injury or whether they tried to protect themselves. But in Jay's case, the publicly released details don't go that far. There's another critical detail from the post-mortem that deserves attention. Forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Shepherd noted multiple abrasions across Jay's body, specifically on his cheeks, arms, left thigh, and right leg. Most strikingly, he documented a large laceration on the left front side of Jay's head, paired with a skull fracture caused by what he described as the application of considerable force. That fracture extended into the base of the brain, further supporting the idea that this was a catastrophic and instantly fatal injury. But while this may sound like the textbook result of a fall, it's important to remember. Abrasions and lacerations can also be caused before the fall, through blunt force trauma, physical assault, or dragging. Without confirmation of hemorrhaging around the wounds, it's difficult to establish definitively whether these injuries occurred pre- or post-mortem. If Jay had been attacked, struck in the head, or pushed into a rough surface, these same injuries might present similarly to those sustained in a fall. A powerful blow to the head with a heavy object, for instance, could create the exact same type of laceration and fracture observed during the post-mortem. And in the context of a body discovered at the base of a ravine, it becomes far easier for intentional wounds to be interpreted as accidental. The abrasions on his arms and legs also raise questions. Were they the result of him tumbling down rocky terrain, or could they suggest a struggle, restraint, or forced movement through the environment before death? In either case, the potential for earlier trauma to be masked by fall-related injuries is very real, especially when environmental exposure may have further degraded the body's ability to speak clearly. There's no mention of defensive injuries, no confirmation of bruising to the arms or hands, and no detailed breakdown of soft tissue trauma that could help identify whether any injuries occurred before or after death. In fact, one of the major limitations in this case is the environmental exposure Jay's body faced. After disappearing in mid-June, his remains were only found in mid-July, nearly a month later, in the intense summer heat of Tenerife. That kind of heat doesn't just accelerate decomposition. It can also destroy vital forensic evidence. Bruising fades, internal hemorrhaging becomes harder to detect, DNA traces degrade. The longer a body lies exposed in those conditions, the harder it becomes to make clear determinations about timing, sequence, and cause of injuries. So we're left with a limited window of understanding. Yes, Jay suffered fatal trauma. Yes, that trauma is consistent with a fall. But the absence of other key forensic indicators, or at least the absence of that information from public reports, means we can't completely rule out the possibility that something happened before the fall. Was Jay injured before he went into the ravine? Was he unconscious or already deceased when he fell, or was he pushed? Were there other signs, now lost, that might have told a different story? For now, those answers remain out of reach. And in a case already shrouded in so many unknowns, the body may be the only witness, but one that cannot speak. In any suspicious death investigation, time is the enemy, and so is the environment. Jay Slater's body lay exposed in the rugged ravine terrain of northern Tenerife for nearly a month. During that time, it endured high summer temperatures, direct sunlight, and the natural decomposition that rapidly accelerates in such conditions. And that presents a major forensic problem. Because while bones tell one story, soft tissue tells another. And in Jay's case, much of that soft tissue evidence would have significantly degraded or vanished by the time he was found. Forensic science is powerful, but it's not magic. Evidence like subdermal bruising, hemorrhaging, or ligature marks, which can indicate strangulation, restraint, or assault, are highly time-sensitive. In warm climates, decomposition begins within hours. Skin discolors, tissue breaks down, and with it goes the vital forensic fingerprint that could distinguish between accident and intent. Even more concerning is the degradation of trace evidence. If Jay had been attacked, if someone grabbed him, struck him, or handled his body, you'd expect touch DNA, hair strands, or clothing fibers from another person. But under prolonged heat exposure, and with natural environmental elements like insects, plant abrasion, and humidity, such delicate traces don't often survive. Heat dries out the skin, accelerates bloating and rupture, and washes away the microscopic clues that investigators rely on. Then there's the impact of wildlife and terrain. Jay was found in an isolated and uneven ravine, an area difficult to access and search thoroughly. Animals, insects, and natural erosion could have easily disrupted the scene. This isn't just about forensic loss, it's about forensic distortion. A body moved slightly by wildlife or dislodged by rain can result in injury patterns that are mistaken for trauma, or vice versa. So even though the post-mortem revealed clear evidence of fatal injuries, the lack of forensic context surrounding those injuries, such as what happened immediately before, whether any evidence of a struggle existed, or if anyone else's DNA was present, is precisely what keeps the door open to alternative theories. To be clear, this doesn't mean foul play occurred, but it does mean that foul play cannot be ruled out with scientific certainty, and that's where frustration begins, for the public, for Jay's loved ones, and for everyone trying to piece together the truth. Because if the body had been discovered earlier, days instead of weeks, the forensic picture might have been clearer. A wound might have looked different. A bruise might have told a fuller story. In that sense, the ravine itself didn't just hide Jay's body. It may have hidden the answers too. The difference between a tragic accident and a calculated act can come down to just a few inches and a few seconds. In the case of Jay Slater, found at the base of a ravine in remote Tenerife, the assumption has always leaned towards a fall, a misstep, a fatal accident in unfamiliar terrain. But what if that's not the whole story? There's a crucial distinction in forensics between someone who slips and someone who is pushed. In a controlled fall, the body often reflects certain telltale signs, patterns of tumbling injuries, inconsistent bruising, and unprotected impact points. A person who trips may try to brace themselves, resulting in defensive injuries to the hands, arms, or elbows. But a person who is pushed, especially from behind, often doesn't have time to react. Jay's injuries were severe. According to the post-mortem, he suffered a skull fracture from considerable force, pelvic damage, and multiple abrasions across the body. That profile is consistent with a fall, yes, but it's also consistent with a deliberate shove off a ledge. And if that shove occurred unexpectedly, or from someone Jay didn't anticipate danger from, it could explain why no signs of self-protection were observed. The location where Jay was found matters too. He wasn't discovered along a walking path or roadside. His body was found at the bottom of a steep and jagged ravine, described by locals as difficult to access and dangerous even for experienced hikers. Some locals have said it's not a place you end up by accident. It's somewhere you'd have to climb toward or be led to. So how did Jay end up there? If he was truly fleeing, running blindly through the landscape, could he have tripped and gone over the edge? Well, it's possible. But equally possible is that he wasn't alone, and that someone directed him towards that fatal location. Whether it was during a confrontation, a scuffle, or a cold act of violence, a push from that kind of height would deliver injuries nearly indistinguishable from those sustained in a fall, especially after weeks of exposure. And unless the body lands in a way that preserves very specific forensic markers, such as a shoulder dislocation from being grabbed, or scrape marks on the back from being dragged, those signs can be lost or too degraded to interpret. Then there's the uncomfortable question: would someone have a reason to push him? If Jay had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to, or was involved in a disagreement, especially related to drugs, money, or stolen property, it isn't unthinkable that a confrontation turned deadly. In an isolated area with no witnesses and no cameras, a fatal push could be passed off as a tragic misadventure. And in cases like this, where a delay in finding the body diminishes the quality of evidence, that cover story might just stick. So was it a fall or a push? We may never know, but the possibility that Jay didn't fall by accident, but was forced to fall, is one that cannot and should not be dismissed. There's a troubling reality in forensic pathology that few outside the field fully grasp. When a body is found at the bottom of a steep drop, especially after weeks in the open, some injuries are expected, and others can be misleading. The damage from a fall can be catastrophic. Bones fracture, tissue tears. The impact rearranges the evidence. But what happens when that same destruction masks something far more sinister? Jay Slater's autopsy confirmed a skull fracture caused by considerable force, as well as multiple abrasions across his limbs and face. On paper, it aligns with a high-impact fall. But those injuries don't exclude the possibility of pre-existing trauma, such as a blow to the head, strangulation, or blunt force assault that may have occurred before the fall, or even instead of it. In cases where a body is found in a ravine or similar terrain, the post-fall damage is often so excessive that subtler injuries are impossible to detect. For instance, if someone was struck on the head with a heavy object, the resulting wound, a depressed skull fracture or internal bleeding, might become indistinguishable from a head injury caused by a rock during a fall. And if the body remained in the heat and elements for an extended time, bruising, hemorrhaging, and fine trauma patterns could degrade to the point where they leave no trace at all. This is especially problematic when there is no one around to witness the fall. No surveillance footage, no reliable digital data trail. It means investigators must rely heavily on the body itself, and when the body has been lying exposed to 30+ degree heat for days or weeks, it becomes the killer's best friend. In Jay's case, the report does not appear to rule out the possibility that his injuries occurred before any fall, nor does it specify whether a forensic pathologist was able to determine the timing of the head wound, whether it occurred while he was still alive, or as a result of post-mortem movement. There's also the risk of confirmation bias. Once a fall is assumed, especially in a setting like a remote ravine, all other injuries tend to be interpreted through that lens. A fracture becomes a landing injury. A torn scalp becomes a rock impact. A broken pelvis becomes expected damage. But if the truth is different, if Jay was assaulted and then placed or pushed into the ravine, then the fall becomes camouflage, hiding the real cause of death under a believable scenario. It's not unprecedented. There have been cases where victims were beaten or killed elsewhere and then thrown from heights to stage an accident. Sometimes the truth only emerges through overlooked clues, a shoe missing that couldn't have come off naturally, or injuries inconsistent with the terrain. But in Jay's case, the environment and the delay in discovery may have erased those clues before they could ever be found. What we're left with is this: a young man with fatal injuries in a place he had no business being, with no clear explanation for how he got there, and a body that may have kept its darkest secrets hidden beneath the trauma of the fall. Jay Slater's final phone location was logged on the morning of June the 17th. His body was discovered on July the 15th, nearly 4 weeks later, and less than a kilometre from that final phone ping. That 28-day gap is not just baffling, it's devastating. Because from the very start, this was the area that search teams had focused on. Ground units, helicopters, drones, dogs, all had combed the rugged terrain of the mountains. Volunteers walked the same paths. Emergency personnel scanned the same ridges. Drones captured footage from the air. But somehow, Jay remained undetected for nearly a month, in a location that, by all accounts, was within the original search radius. It is true that the area was challenging. The terrain is steep, uneven, and riddled with sharp volcanic rock and dense bush. Visibility is often obstructed by outcrops and overhangs. But those factors only go so far in explaining such a prolonged delay. Many have asked, how can a body lie out in the open for 4 weeks and be missed? Some reports claimed that search teams had already covered the area where Jay was eventually found. Spanish Civil Guard officials publicly stated that key zones of the ravine were searched by air and foot. So the idea that Jay's body lay there undisturbed all that time raises an unsettling possibility that he wasn't there the entire time. It's a theory that has echoed online, in media coverage, and in the minds of those following the case. Could Jay have been moved after death? Could he have been alive somewhere else in the hours or even days after his disappearance, only to be placed or discarded in the ravine later? There's no hard evidence proving that theory, but the delay in discovering his body, despite its proximity to the last known location, leaves the door wide open. And then there's a forensic dilemma, because the longer a body remains exposed to heat and time, the more vital evidence is lost. In the intense summer heat of Tenerife, decomposition begins within hours. After nearly a month, much of the soft tissue, trace evidence, and environmental markers that might have indicated foul play would have been severely degraded, or gone altogether. If Jay had been restrained, struck, or drugged, those signs could easily have vanished in the heat. Even trace DNA, fingerprints, or hairs from another person, the kinds of clues that might suggest another presence, are unlikely to survive prolonged exposure to the elements. Some believe the failure to find Jay sooner may have been the result of search teams making assumptions, assuming he had walked further or had moved in another direction. Others ask whether parts of the ravine were written off too early as inaccessible or too dangerous to check thoroughly. In either case, the result was the same. Jay Slater remained undiscovered, just a short distance from where his phone had cried out its final signal. And that discovery, after 28 days, came too late to provide many of the answers that mattered. Had he been found within the first few days, forensic examiners might have been able to tell whether his injuries occurred before or after death, whether another person had been nearby, or whether any substances in his system could explain his behavior. Instead, we're left with a haunting scenario: that the ravine where Jay was found may have done more to conceal his body. It may have concealed the truth. Whether that delay was an accident, a failure in the search, or something darker, we may never know. But for a young man who disappeared in broad daylight, in a known location, during a massive search operation, this delay has left an open wound in the timeline, and it has left his family and the public asking one simple but painful question: how was he missed? The place where Jay Slater was found is no ordinary stretch of wilderness. It's remote, difficult to access, and dangerously disorienting for anyone unfamiliar with its layout. But for someone who knows the terrain well, this same landscape becomes something else entirely: an asset. This brings us to one of the more subtle but critical questions in this case. Who knew the land well enough to either lead Jay there or to use it as a hiding place? The Airbnb where Jay spent his final hours was located in Mascar. It wasn't a spot tourists casually stumble upon. It was out of the way, far from the main festival scene, and required serious intention to get to. This wasn't a beachfront property. This was isolation by design. Now consider this. The two men Jay was last seen with, Ayub Kasim and Stephen Roccas, had local knowledge of Tenerife. They weren't just tourists. They'd been seen on the island before and seemed comfortable navigating its back roads. Ayub even bragged about how quickly he drove from the main strip to the Airbnb. And yet, despite their proximity to Jay during his final hours, they offered virtually nothing of substance about what happened to him, or where he might have gone. Some believe that local knowledge could have been the key to orchestrating what came next. If Jay was chased, or if he fled, it's possible he was directed, intentionally or not, into a part of the terrain that only locals would understand the dangers of. It's easy to get disoriented in those hills. One wrong turn and you're out of view from all paths and signals. For someone without experience of the area, it would feel like a maze with no exit. For someone who knows it, it's a way to disappear someone, or to leave them stranded. Others suggest a more sinister possibility, that Jay didn't end up in the ravine by accident. If something happened at or near the Airbnb, and those involved wanted to cover their tracks, knowing the terrain would be essential. You'd need to know where a body could be dropped that was just far enough from the known search radius, but still difficult to spot. You'd need to understand where drones could and couldn't see, and where ground access would be difficult without specialist climbing equipment. The area where Jay was found was not easily accessible. That much is true. But it is accessible enough if you know how to get there, and more importantly, it's familiar ground to those who live or work in the region. Local shepherds, farmers, landowners, or repeat visitors would know the footpaths, blind spots, and drops. If you wanted to hide something or someone, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better location in Tenerife than a deep, sun-exposed ravine in the Mascar Hills. And there's one more thing to consider: Jay's own unfamiliarity with the environment. He wasn't a hiker. He wasn't equipped for mountainous terrain. He had no water, no charger, and no map. He wasn't dressed for a trek, so the idea that he would intentionally set off into such a hazardous zone alone, and without panic, seems less likely. Unless, Of course, something or someone frightened him enough to believe that was his only option. So we ask again, who would know this land well enough to exploit it? And if someone did, were they just lucky that Jay's body remained hidden for nearly a month? Or did they know exactly what they were doing? One of the most troubling questions in Jay Slater's death is not just how he died, but when. When Jay was finally found at the bottom of the ravine, the post-mortem reports cited injuries consistent with a fall from height. As we mentioned, a large laceration on the left side of his head, a skull fracture that extended to the base of his brain, multiple abrasions across his body, cheeks, arms, thighs, and legs. The kind of injuries you'd expect from tumbling down jagged terrain. But what if they're also the kind of injuries that could hide something else? It's a disturbing, yet plausible forensic scenario, that a body thrown or pushed from a significant height, or even staged after death, might display secondary injuries that make it incredibly difficult to determine the true cause of death. In other words, if someone wanted to mask foul play, a fall from height could do the job. When someone falls, especially on rocky terrain, injuries are distributed in chaotic patterns. Head trauma, lacerations, and broken bones become part of the expected injury profile. But if someone had already suffered a blunt force blow to the head, how would investigators know the difference once decomposition sets in, and trauma from the fall overlaps with earlier wounds? Let's consider what we know from the post-mortem. Dr. Richard Shepard noted the skull fracture resulted from considerable force and extended into the lower brain, a potentially fatal injury on its own. But the problem is, a fall could cause this, and so could a deliberate blow from an object or assault. Forensic pathology can sometimes tell the difference, especially in fresh cases. But after 4 weeks of exposure to heat, sun, wildlife and terrain, as we've mentioned, soft tissues degrade, internal bleeding is harder to detect, and the skin's integrity, which helps determine pre- or post-mortem injury, can be compromised. Time becomes the criminal's best friend. Add to that the multiple abrasions on Jay's body, which could have occurred during a fall, but also during a struggle or dragging event, or even a staged placement of the body. Without more detailed forensic disclosures, it's impossible to rule out the possibility that some of these injuries happened before the fall, not because of it. And that's where the theory gets darker. Because if someone hit Jay, caused serious head trauma, and then pushed through or placed him into the ravine, the injuries from the fall would act like a smoke screen. They would create plausible deniability. They would provide the exact kind of forensic confusion needed to turn a murder into an accident. We're not saying that's what happened, but we are saying the possibility exists, and it has precedent. In criminal cases across the world, bodies have been dumped down slopes or over ledges for the specific purpose of masking injuries. From mountaintop homicides in the Alps to cases of bodies dumped in quarries or ravines, the logic is chilling, but effective. Let nature rearrange the evidence. That's why it's vital to ask whether Jay's injuries, serious, traumatic, and undoubtedly fatal, all came from the fall, or whether one came first. If the blow to the skull was deliberate, and the fall was secondary, then we are not looking at a tragic accident. We're looking at a cover-up. With the official narrative pointing to a fall, and the post-mortem confirming injuries consistent with that theory, many would expect the case to rest. But it hasn't, and for good reason. The public still has questions, serious ones. Why would Jay Slater, a young man with no hiking experience, wearing street clothes and without water or a phone charger, willingly walk into one of the most unforgiving parts of Tenerife? Why would he leave shelter and safety behind and head into an exposed ravine under a scorching sun? More importantly, how was he not found for 24 days? His last known phone location was in the vicinity of where his body was eventually discovered. As we've mentioned, search teams, helicopters, drones and dogs were all deployed. So how did they all miss him? Was he moved there later? Was he concealed in some way? Or was the search less thorough than we were led to believe? There's also the question of injuries. The laceration to Jay's head was described as the result of considerable force, not just a bump or scrape. Could this injury have occurred before the fall? Could it have come from an object or attack, then been disguised by the descent into the ravine? Then there's the timeline. Why did the men he was last with vanish from public view? Why has there been no detailed explanation of what Jay was doing that morning, how he left, or who was still at the Airbnb? Why did Lucy Law go to the Airbnb after reporting him missing, and then retreat entirely from social media discussion? The unanswered questions keep growing. Even with a body, even with a cause of death marked consistent with a fall, the case remains full of doubt. For every answer, 2 new mysteries emerge. And for many observers, this is what makes it so chilling. Not just what happened, but how easily it could be misunderstood, misrepresented, or misused. So was this truly an accident? Or has the landscape of Tenerife, its rocks, ravines, and heat, hidden the truth so well that even the official story might never be the full one? In the end, we're left with a tragic fact. Jay Slater is gone. His body was discovered in a place that had already been searched. His injuries suggest a fall, but not necessarily how or why it happened. And those 2 questions, how and why, remain as elusive as the moment he vanished. On paper, it's a tragic accident. A young man under the influence, lost in unfamiliar terrain, making a fatal misstep. But the deeper we go, the less that explanation satisfies. The terrain wasn't just rough, it was perilous. Jay was not dressed or equipped for a hike. He had no water, no charger. His last known location was downhill from the Airbnb, but he was later found deeper into the ravine, a difficult path even for experienced hikers. If he was disoriented, why head further away from safety? Why push into more danger, not less? Then there's a gap. The time between the disappearance and discovery, nearly a month, in terrain that was searched, in the zone where his phone last pinged. Not in some cave, not under thick tree cover, but in a ravine within view of several vantage points. It's not hard to ask, was his body there the whole time? Even if we accept that he died on the 17th of June, as most believe, we are still left with haunting possibilities. Could he have been assaulted first? Could he have been pushed? Was the fall a tragic accident, or a way to stage something more sinister? The injuries raise eyebrows. The laceration and skull fracture were described as a result of considerable force. That alone invites questions, especially when considering how a fall can be used to disguise intentional harm. In forensic history, we've seen cases where perpetrators exploited terrain, gravity, and time to mask a crime. Could this be one of them? The truth may never be fully known, but as this chapter closes, one truth remains certain. Too much doesn't add up. There are too many unanswered questions, too many conflicting details, and too many opportunities for the truth to slip through the cracks. Jay Slater's death deserves clarity. His family deserves peace. And the public, who watched this case unfold with grief, concern, and growing suspicion, deserves answers. So was it just a fall? Or was it something far more calculated? A body left to be found, in a place where it would raise more questions than it could ever answer. Jay Slater's story cannot, and should not, be simplified into a clean, convenient narrative. The location, the injuries, the timeline, the people involved, none of it fits neatly into a box. And that's exactly why this case still matters. Because even if the official line is death by misadventure, too many details remain unresolved. Too many people are silent. too many pieces don't connect. What happened in that ravine may never be fully known, but dismissing it as a simple accident without confronting the very real inconsistencies does a disservice not only to Jay, but to every person who's ever disappeared under suspicious circumstances and been denied justice. This episode was made to confront one of the most plausible, yet deeply unsettling possibilities, that the fall wasn't the cause, but the cover. If you found value in this episode, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. We're releasing a new episode every 2 days, each one dissecting a different angle of this haunting case. And if you have thoughts, questions, or information, leave a comment below. Together we'll keep asking the hard questions until answers finally emerge.